Hello, friends. Welcome to Timeless Tagore Chiroshoka, a series of conversations brought to you by the Tagorians UK, the oldest Bengali cultural organization in the UK. In this conversation series, we will introduce you to various eminent personalities who have been fundamental in helping to keep Tagore truly timeless through their active and passionate service to our communities in their respective fields. My guest today is a dear friend, a founder member of the Tagorians who was born into the organization, and an award winning, critically acclaimed writer, playwright, and dramatist who has been writing for the stage, for radio, and for television for over 30 years. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, the recipient of multiple awards and accolades for over 20 years, and honored by the prestigious MBE, a member of the Order of the British Empire. I have great pleasure in introducing you to Tanika Gupta. Thank you, Tanika, and welcome to Timeless Tagore, Chiroshoka. We'd like to start by asking you about your association with the Tagorians. You're clearly one of the earliest conscripted members of the organization, and probably one of the youngest at that time, given that the organization was founded by your parents, Tapunda Goirikadi, when you were a mere toddler. So do tell us about your associations, your experiences in those early formative years of the Tagorians.
Well, I have to say conscripted is the right word because I didn't really have a choice at that age. Ma and Baba and Dopan and Gurika were absolutely devoted Tagore followers, and Ma was a dancer and Baba was a singer. And I think in those early years when they came to Britain, I think my father came in 1961.
Right.
I think that they were very, very keen to keep the Tagore alive, keep their Tagore alive. So they set up the Tagorians. And what they used to do is put on dance dramas and take them around the European continent. So those are some of my earliest memories of jiggling around in the back of a minibus. And they would go to places like Austria and Germany and even Sweden and perform with a group of other Bengalis. Most of the other people that they performed with were young students, medical students, right, accountants, doctors, lawyers, or just other Bengalis like themselves. So I would say amateur, but semi-professional became later on.
Sure.
And they had a tape of all of this, John Dalika and Shama, that my aunt, my Pishi in Kolkata, had recorded for them. And so it was huge fun. I mean,
I should add at this stage is Maya Shen, the noted Tagore music exponent. Yes. Wow, so she would record have the soundtrack recorded and then
with the musicians and everything.
With the musicians, yes.
And even my kaku, who was Shobhan Gupta, also sang in those. So he sang parts like the Doyala. So yes. They were very professional recordings, and of course, as a child, I had no choice. So from the age of about 3, I have very early memories of just having lots and lots of aunts, and to me they were like aunts, but actually when I look back on it now, I think some of them were only about 16. And we would go to places like Austria, for example, where I remember as a young child, people would come up to my mother in the street and literally go like this to her to see whether the colour came off, because they'd never seen Indians there. Yes. But having said that, they weren't racist or anything. They were just very inquisitive,
fascinated, and it was something new and something to be experienced. Wow.
Yes, and I do remember very clearly once we were performing, or they were performing. I was just in the audience, probably drinking a bottle of milk. But I do remember this very clearly, that in the middle of John Dalika, my mother was playing John Dalika. Right. The sound, everything went, and they couldn't work out what had happened. And it turned out one of the kids of one of the Dutch audiences had just unplugged it all. So, and I remember my father shouting, "It's the hippies, they've been left." But they were very, I mean, apart from anything else, they got to see a lot of Europe.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was a kind of tourist thing as well.
And Europe got to see a lot of Tagore. So I guess it must have been fascinating in that time and that age particularly.
And what I love about it was they were unapologetic. They didn't do any translation or anything. They just put the shows on. And because Tagore's dance dramas are so vivid. You don't really,
Evocative, and everything is, language isn't a barrier, clearly.
Yes, and the story of John Donne is so wonderful. That it's very. It didn't seem to need translation, and they really enjoyed it. They seemed to really enjoy it.
So you have had an illustrious career for over 30 years, writing stage plays, radio plays, and television dramas. I find it fascinating that some of your early works include adaptations of some of Tagore's seminal pieces. I'm talking particularly about your work Red Oleanders, which is a adaptation of Rabindranath's Rokto Korubi, and also of Home and the World, an adaptation of Ghore Baire. I also believe that your first stage production, The Skeleton, was based on a short story by Tagore. So tell me, what inspired you to write about some of these specific pieces by Tagore? And what did you do to make these works more accessible to Western audiences?
So you have to go back to Mahan Baba again,
Yeah.
which is that they both were at Shantiniketan. So they basically imbued dance and drama all the way through our childhood. So there's always songs, there's always dancing, there was always stories. So my father was an amazing storyteller, to the point where he would tell so many stories that we would get a little bit bored. So even, we'd get in the car in the morning and he'd start telling us the story of the Mahabharata. And if he hadn't finished the story by the time we got into school, we'd have to wait in the car until he'd finished. The school bell had gone, everyone had gone in, and we were still sitting there waiting for him to finish the story. So what I'm saying is we came from a family of stories, so it was very inevitable in a way that I would become a writer. In fact, my father told me right from when I was very young, you will be a writer when you grow up, which is very different from a lot of the Asian girls in my class who were told
doctors,
doctor, lawyer, accountant. Yes. So obviously, this is what I grew up with Tagore stories. And the great thing I learnt quite early on as a playwright is that we're magpies. So we basically pick up stories from wherever we can.
Yes.
And so in those early days, those are the stories I knew. So Gonkal, the short story about the skeleton, and Rokto Korubi, and Red Oleander, and Ghore Baire, they were all stories that I knew. So those were the ones that I started basically dissecting and making it into my own, because they're such good stories. And it's the same with Shakespeare. I mean, he took all his stories, not that I'm comparing myself to Shakespeare, but he took all his stories from elsewhere as well. Yeah. So they were part of my culture at that time, so I wanted to tell those stories. But even with Skeleton, I literally took the nub of the story, which is there is a skeleton in the closet and she comes to life at night. And then I made
the rest of it was your own.
Yeah.
Which brings me on to, how did you make it accessible, I guess, to Western audiences? Maybe that was it. So you took the germ of the idea
and just made it my own. And actually, that's what I've done all my life, is adaptations as well, where you look at something that you love, and then you make it your own. You inject your own creativity and imagination into it. So yes, I mean, and also Rokto Korubi was translated by Tagore himself.
Yes.
But as we all know, and this is no disrespect to the man, his English translations were not great. So
there were enough examples of
there's too many thous and these, and it's not
maybe a product of the writing at the time, or the language that was in use at the time. But
so it was really about updating it and making it. But I think even now, I would love to do Red Oleanders again, because it's such a current subject, isn't it? But I have to go on to say that one of my big criticisms of Bengalis at the time when I was growing up was that they were too obsessed with Tagore. And that actually, and this is something that I always used to argue with my father about, which is that he himself was a very gifted writer. And he was so concerned with Tagore that he never developed his own writing.
Understand what you mean.
Or his poetry or his plays. And I said to him quite a few times, why don't you just put it to one side? And I think because he felt that he could never be as good as Tagore, who could be, quite frankly.
Sure.
So that's when you need that's when my own arrogance kicked in, and I just thought, I'm not going to have anything to do with Tagore now. I'm going to pave my own way. And of course, as you get older, you keep going back to Tagore.
Yes, indeed. So, Tanika, that brings me neatly on to my next question. So I'm so glad that you decided to to kind of draw from Tagore, but not get constrained by him, and actually take your own twists and turns from there. So tell me, I mean, we know that every playwright, every writer, filmmaker, when they look at Tagore, or indeed any other iconic playwrights and writers through history, they always bring their own interpretation to the original pieces of work. Could you tell us about some of your own experimentations, your own ideas, your own techniques that you would have used, the innovations that you would have used to bring Tagore to life, if you like?
Well, I think one of the great things about watching my parents on stage all those years as a child, and also being pushed onto stage myself. I mean, I did actually do some dancing as a village girl at some point in one of those things.
Right.
Is that you get to see live action on stage. And I think what's interesting now is that I do a lot of teaching, and it's very interesting how a lot of students don't actually understand that when you put a play on stage, you actually have to also write not just the dialogue, but what they're doing. What's the action on stage? How are you entertaining you can't just have people coming into an audience and sitting watching people talking to each other. They have to actually do things. And that's what was so wonderful about having organically understood that from quite a young age, that people dance, people sing, people, spout poetry in the middle of it, or they look at the audience and they speak, do a soliloquy, like a Shakespearean soliloquy almost.
Yeah.
And that actually, so those were the things that came quite naturally to my writing. But in terms of experimentation, once you start writing plays, you do get involved with other directors and actors, and that's what's so wonderful about writing for theatre. It's not just about it being a live action, a narrative, but it's also about collaborating.
Yes.
And collaboration is really, really important. It's not like writing a novel where you just sit for hours writing a sentence beautifully, but it's about reading your work out loud, not being afraid to share it, because so many writers are desperately scared of showing their writing to anyone. And I always say, you've got to make a fool of yourself, otherwise nobody will come and see your shows if you can't show it to anyone. So in terms of experimentation, I've worked with people who are puppeteers, people who are trapeze artists, as well as straightforward actors and directors. But you get to work with designers, with sound people, with musicians, with composers, with extraordinary actors who go, I don't need to say this because I can do this with a look. And you go, yeah, well then cut that line. So you have to be able to, I suppose in a way, cut your own work, edit your own work, and not be too precious about it.
So tell me, Tanika, a number of your plays have been focused on the life, the times, the stories associated with the British Raj, and that period in India's chapter around its struggle for independence and freedom. So, what was it about that particular episode in history that was fascinating for you? Was it the conflicting political ideologies of the time? Was it the struggles of a nation kind of seeking its identity and coming to life, if you like? It'd be very fascinating to know what was it that inspired you to choose that period in a lot of your works.
So I would say that as a writer, I've sort of concentrate on different periods or different moments, and it's to do with my own little obsessions at the time. So as an early playwright, I was really writing mainly about Asian women, particularly British Asian women in this country. I worked in a refuge for young Asian women, so I wrote a lot about
this refuge was Manchester, was
yes,
it?
Yes. It was, it was for young women who were escaping domestic violence. So a lot of my early work was kind of about that. And then as the years progressed, I've written all sorts of things like sex tourism in Jamaica and knife crime in schools. So a lot of quite political plays. But I think more recently I seem to have become more obsessed with. I shouldn't say obsessed. My passion is looking at decolonising history. So I am a historian by nature. That's what I studied at university. And so it sort of crept back into me as the years have gone by.
Right.
And I think it's very current at the moment, which is that I'm very aware that when we were at school, we never learnt anything about Indian history. We didn't even learn about Indians in Britain. It was always about the Tudors, the Stuarts, the First World War, the English Civil War, nothing about, not even about slavery. So, and I think that this is coming back to haunt the British right now. I mean, we look at the politics now. And so, in a sense, I have been encouraged by theatres to explore those areas, whereas if 20 years ago nobody would have put those plays on. But also because of being Bengali, Bengalis are, right from the beginning, I would always say that the Bengali people that I was around, not just my family but their friends as well, were quite political. They talked a lot.
I can imagine that.
They talked a lot about books and literature. And then it comes back to Tagore as well.
Yes.
Tagore gave back his knighthood.
Knighthood. Yeah.
That was something that I learnt about from my family, but again, never ever talked about in school. In all the history that I ever learnt, I never knew about. Well, I knew about it, but I didn't learn about the Amritsar massacre. I didn't really know very much about Gandhi. I didn't know anything about Indians in the First World War, Indian soldiers. So all these things I'm sort of almost relearning, and these are fascinating subjects to look at, those stories. And one of my favourite stories is about the Ayers and the Luskers, who were in Britain in the 19th century. Again, nobody writes about them, nobody talks about them, and yet in 1880 there was a refuge for Ayers who'd actually been who'd been kind of rejected by their English owners, masters, and there was a refuge in Mare Street in Hackney, and something like 100 Indian women went through that every year, who had been.
That is
I know,
that's
exactly.
Nobody, as you said, nobody knows about that.
And the Luskers are the sailors who were, running all the ships for the empire, all Indian, a lot of Bengali, from East Bengal, and they settled in Tower Hamlets, which is where the Tilbury docks were. So it's all that history of our own people in this country going back over 150 years.
Yeah, wow.
Which I think is just fascinating to write plays about.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So, Tanika, that explains a lot. I now understand your fascination with that particular chapter in Indian history, which brings me on to my next question, which is around lions and tigers. I was fortunate enough to see it while it was premiering at Shakespeare's Globe in London. But what were some of the challenges that you must have faced? Because I believe you only had a family journal and some odd letters to kind of construct the story on. So please tell me, the story behind the making of Lions and Tigers, if you like, and of course about the play itself.
Yes, so Lions and Tigers comes from the story of my great uncle Dinesh Gupta, who was hanged by the British in 1931, and this is one of those family stories that I heard from day one, almost as the same time I heard about Tagore. So I remember as a 9-year-old, I went to India for the first time. I went to Calcutta, and I was taken to my dadu's house, my grandfather, and his older brother's house in Behala in Kolkata, and they lived on a street called Shohid Dinesh Gupta Road. Right. And I remember very clearly they took me into a room and they pulled out these spectacles and this picture, and they said, "This was your great uncle, and he was our brother, and he was hanged." I mean, obviously at 9 years old I thought, what the hell is going on here? I don't know what are these people talking about. But actually over the years I got to know more about him. And the fascinating thing about Dinesh Gupta is that whilst he was in prison awaiting his sentence, his execution rather, he wrote letters back to his family. So he wrote something like 90 letters, which my grandfather had collected. Half of them were in English, so they were written to his brothers in English, and the other half were in Bengali that he'd written to the women in the family. And they were beautiful lyrical letters written in such gorgeous handwriting. And he talks about the monsoon rains, and he talks about mangoes. In fact, Manushi Burua helped me to translate some of them, because I had them so long and I didn't even know what they said because I don't read Bengali. So in a sense I was sitting on this mine of information, and I just kept thinking this boy was only 19 when he ran into Writers' Building and shot and killed the Inspector General of Prisons. So he was very much seen as a hero in the family. And I remember when I first started trying to look him up and research him, I went to the library, the British Library, newspaper library, to try and find him, and I couldn't find any mention of Dinesh Gupta anywhere. I came home and I said to my father, I can't find anything about him. He said, what are you looking him under? And I said, I'm looking him up under freedom fighter. And he said, have you tried terrorist? And so I went back and I looked under Indian terrorist, and there he was. All the articles about him. And of course it never even occurred to me. So for years and years I kind of kept looking at these articles and things about him. But and I tried to write a play. It was the first play I tried to write when I was about in my early 20s. But nobody would put it on. It wasn't, I don't think it was very well written. And it took me 25 years to write that play. Partly because I needed to be more skillful as a playwright, but also partly because I needed to find the structure of it. And I was really interested in the fact that in 1930, when he did this thing and when he ended up in prison, the prisons were full of civil disobedience people who had been arrested after the Salt March with Gandhi. Yeah. So these two movements were going along together, side by side. The insurrectionists who believed, like my great uncle, who believed in violent insurrection against the British, and of course
and the Gandhian philosophy, yes.
And of course in Bengal people are not mad keen on Gandhi, so it was quite interesting to try and look at a different side of him rather than the one that we've seen in the Attenborough film. Yeah. It's interesting that it took 25 years for I could get plays on about knife crime in schools or prisons or anything like that I could get on, but I couldn't get this play on because it was very uncomfortable for the British theatre industry to see a play with an Indian man running around shooting at English officers. Even if there is so I needed to dig deeper and find out more about the psyche, and I got to know a lot about my family. I mean, by the time the play was on, most of the family had passed away. In terms of him and obviously and his brothers, etc. But what I kept inside me was that my dadu, right until he died, and he died when he was like in his 90s, he always talked about his younger brother Dinesh. There was such love for him. What he always says was, because my dadu was a doctor, he said he should not have killed anyone. That was wrong. We didn't know that he was going to do that. We felt that he was brainwashed. But we're so proud of him. And so he talked about him, and his older brother talked about him right until the end. And I just thought, it's oral history, isn't it?
Yes,
it's a family story, and that's what makes it so wonderful. Yeah. I think in a way, it's a human story, and it's not saying that he was right to have done what he did.
And I guess I can completely understand the sentiments behind this, and what a fascinating and fantastic personal journey it must have been for you, especially, revisiting this chapter after so many years. And what a fitting tribute, therefore, that in 2018 this play was recognized for the wonderful writing and as a wonderful tribute, I guess, to Dinesh Gupta himself, when you won the University of Edinburgh's, what was it? The
James Tate Black Award, yeah.
James Tate Black Award. So we've just been talking about lions and tigers at the Globe. So I know this is in 2017. I know you were curating the Festival of Independence at Shakespeare's Globe that year, which was marking 70 years of India's independence in a 3-month-long event at the Globe, series of events at the Globe. You were instrumental in actually ensuring that Tagore was staged for the first time at Shakespeare's Globe as part of that iconic, prestigious festival. And you were pivotal in getting the Tagorians to put up a performance of Tagore's works during that festival. What was it that wanted you to get Tagore to be featured in that festival and to get the Tagorians to undertake that particular project?
Well, it's always that competition between Shakespeare and Tagore that I seem to come across all my life, which is, in this country, if you mention Tagore, I would say 9 times out of 10 people don't know who the hell you're talking about. Whereas if you go anywhere else in the world, I remember running workshops for writing in Cuba, in Argentina, in South Africa. You mentioned Tagore, they all say, yeah, he's great.
Wow.
I remember going to Chile not so long, a couple of years ago, walked into Pablo Neruda's house, and as I walked in, the first thing I saw was a poem by Tagore on the wall.
Fascinating.
The Cubans had all read his poetry in translation in Spanish, so they all know Tagore as a great writer. Whereas in this country, Tagore is not taught.
Yeah.
Not taught, nobody knows about him. And I think part of that is because they already have Shakespeare here. And so to them, to the British, the Shakespeare, you don't need anyone else.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think partly because Tagore's work hasn't been brilliantly translated over the years. I mean, there have been great translations by people like William Radici, obviously.
Yeah.
But still, there's not enough for us to be able to access it in English. So for people like me who don't read and write Bengali, we're absolutely dependent on translations. So going back to your question, which was why Tagore at the Globe, that's why.
Yeah.
Because I wanted him to be celebrated.
Yeah.
Even when you go to the to Stratford upon Avon, you go to see Shakespeare's house. As you're walking around the gardens, you trip over a huge bust of Tagore out there.
Yeah.
So he is acknowledged in certain circles, but not enough. They should put more stuff on at the Globe. So obviously, I wanted to get, since it was about the Festival of Independence, and because Tagore was a nationalist and had a lot of things to say about the subject of the British,
Yes, indeed.
I thought it was very important that we have Tagore in that festival. I mean, there were other things. There was music, there was Nitin Sawhney, there was all sorts of things going on. But Tagore was, I was very clear that we wanted. And so who better to present Tagore at the Globe but the Tagorians? There was no two ways about it. And I thought it was an amazing evening. It was a very emotional evening for me, but it was also a wonderful evening.
No, indeed. And as a Tagorian, as somebody who was lucky enough to be part of that production, I can say on behalf of all of us, it was a fantastic, fascinating, a kind of landmark event, I think, in our journey as members of Tagorians and as Tagore enthusiasts, and memories that will be with us, for a lifetime. So, Tanika, you mentioned a little while back about the lack of Indian history, Indian writing, Indian literature being taught in schools and colleges in this country. Completely understand that. But I find that in that context fascinating that two of your writings, I believe, have made it to the English literature syllabus for the GCSE. That is absolutely amazing. Wish you could tell us a little bit more about those, what exactly those pieces are, and how they came to be included in the GCSE curriculum.
So the two plays that I have on the GCSE curriculum are The Empress, which I wrote for the Royal Shakespeare Company several years ago now, and my more recent adaptation of Ibsen's A Doll's House.
Yeah.
And I think basically The Empress was the first play of a writer of colour in this country to be put on the GCSE curriculum, which is bizarre because I think they had, Shakespeare and all sorts of things like Arthur Miller.
That's even more fantastic.
So I'm not quite sure why mine was chosen, but there was a lot of fanfare about it. It was literally about Queen Victoria's relationship with her Indian manservant, Abdul Karim. But it was also about the arrival of a young Ayah who comes over to Britain in 1888. So I sort of slightly cheated it and made it all about lots of different Indians in Britain at the time. So Abdul Karim, the Ayah, Alaska, who's a sailor. I also had Dadabhai Naoroji, who was the first Indian MP to be elected in 1891. And there were various other characters there, but it's the usual thing where I wanted to show that there were Indians living in Britain, but very important Indians as well. So the Empress, it was called the Empress because of Queen Victoria was the Empress of India, but the real Empress in the play was actually the Ayah. So it's really her story. It actually comes from a photograph I saw in a book when I was about 18 by a woman called Rosina Visram, and she was an English teacher, and she got very fed up with the fact that none of her Asian students knew anything about the fact that they had been here for many, many years. So she wrote a book called Indian Ayahs, Laskars and Princes. Right. And in the book, there's a photograph of a group of ayahs sitting around a dining table somewhere in London. And honestly, you see the photograph and they're all dressed in these black sort of nanny outfits, Victorian nanny outfits. And they're all reading the Bible and they're all sitting around the table and they're looking into the camera and their faces are extraordinary. You know, they're Singaporean, Samoan, Indian. You can see from their faces, some are from South India, some are from Bhutan or, you know, Burma. And just looking at the photograph made me think, who are these women? What are they doing in Victorian London? So that's where the inspiration came from to write that play. And I think what's interesting about the fact that both these plays are on the curriculum is because I think English teachers themselves have been crying out to do plays that are more relevant to their students, not just the Asian students, obviously, but for everyone. So when A Doll's House was put on more recently, I mean, A Doll's House, I set it in Calcutta in the 1870s. It's a mixed race relationship, and it's all about feminism. The original is about feminism, but actually my version is also about race and colonialism. And so I think that it's very accessible to young students. So apparently they're very much enjoying it. But what's interesting is that this country is so much more diverse than it was, and that these stories need to be told in order to kind of make it more relevant, because otherwise you're reading plays you know, like Midsummer Night's Dream, which is wonderful, but you know, how does it
doesn't translate well in current times. No, I completely understand.
So tell me, Tanika, the last 2 years have clearly taken a toll on everyone, physically, mentally, emotionally, and especially for the performing arts. How did you manage your work? How did you manage your projects in the dislocation that was faced by the pandemic? And what exciting upcoming projects can we look forward to?
During the pandemic, I mean, I think everybody went into meltdown in a way, didn't they? And certainly theatre was very badly affected.
Yes.
They're only now just opening a year and a half later. And even then it's all socially distanced, and a lot of the plays are monologues as opposed to lots of people on stage. The theatres are closing down suddenly because somebody's testing positive. So it's very, you know, it's still a very rocky time. But in terms of being a writer during the pandemic, to be honest, nothing changed, because I've always stayed at home, and that my office is in my house, and I've always written there. And I was very fortunate in that I have a nice house, I have a garden, and I had commissions. So I just had to get on with the writing. Where it was very difficult was what was happening with colleagues. So, you know, it's all very well being a writer with commissions, but people who work in theatre, for example, stage managers and lighting designers and, you know, directors, they tend to live from one job to the next. And they were the ones that suffered the most, I think, because they just didn't have any jobs. So
I can imagine,
so at the moment I have a play on at the Lyric Hammersmith, which is a monologue about Gandhi as a teenager when he came to Britain in 1888. Right. And it's one of my another little obsession that I've had for years. I wanted to write something about the man before he became the politician.
Before the Mahatma, let's say.
Yes. And it's quite funny, because all he did was run around London trying to find vegetarian restaurants. But what's interesting is that the actor who's playing him, who's absolutely extraordinary, Isha Ladi, is also a doctor. So during that pandemic, he didn't have any work as an actor. So he was an A&E doctor in Manchester. So he has extraordinary stories to tell about what happened during the pandemic, you know, in terms of whether he had PPE or not, you know, and how many of his colleagues sadly passed away. So, you know, it's very live. I know a lot of actors who are, you see on television, but who were working as post office workers and, you know, shelf stackers in supermarkets. Everybody, it was a great leveler in many ways.
I can understand.
And it really I think theatre really has suffered, and there are a lot of theatres that have closed down as a result. But also what's really fascinating, in the middle of all of this pandemic, we had this Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
With the murder of George Floyd. And I think that something has changed in terms of the stories that theatres need to tell. And I mean, it does kind of come back to race and colonialism and Tagore, because these stories have not been told. And a lot of these stories are now being, I'm getting commissioned by people that wouldn't even look at me 10 years ago, because they understand that they need to tell those stories.
So is there a particular work that you're thinking about? Is there a particular story that you're thinking of developing? Is it back to Tagore? Is it not Tagore? Is it pandemic? Is there a bit of a hint that you can leave with us?
The thing about Tagore is that he's always there in the background, or sort of almost like the subtext of everything. I have
omnipresent, as the Bengalis would say, and
he is omnipresent. And I have a lovely photograph of him up above my desk, next to my family, my parents, and I think that he is an inspiration to my work. But I'm still very stubborn about not just doing adaptations of Tagore, but to use him as inspiration.
Of course.
I love his lyricism in his plays as well as poetry, and I think that there's a place for that in plays. It doesn't all have to be, dialogue where everyone just shouts at each other, or it's clever dialogue. There's a moment for stillness as well, which I think is quite a good thing to try and emulate. But I wouldn't want to try and become Shakespeare or Tagore, because that would be silly. But although, having said that, I love the music in his work. Yes. So I am developing a couple of musicals.
Oh, fantastic. That's something new to look forward to.
Yes, hopefully, yes. A nice West End musical would be great.
Tanika, that's absolutely awesome. We, of course, look forward to a lot more writing from you. And, of course, as a Tagore enthusiast, I'm really encouraged with this last piece of information that you're sharing about musicals and possibly Tagore being taken to the West End. That's brilliant. But we wish you all the very best. Let's hope there's many more projects and wonderful pieces of writing coming from you. Let's hope Tagore, and indeed your own writings, focusing on Indian history, focusing on Black history, history and episodes that are underrepresented in this country so far. That they're constantly made more accessible, that they're brought to audiences and really taken to the mainstream. Thank you so much for this delightful conversation and this opportunity to get to meet Tanika Gupta, the writer. And thanks so much for your for keeping the flame, your family flame of Tagore, flying high.
Thank you very much for having me. It's just wonderful to see 50 years on that my eccentric parents and their singing and dancing that they seem to do all the time is lived on and flourished and blossomed. So thank you for having me.
That's all for today, friends. Stay tuned to the Tagorians and our conversation series, Timeless Tagore, Chiroshoka, where we will keep bringing to you various different personalities in the fields of music, dance, art, culture, literature, theatre, and education, who have been playing a vital role in helping to keep Tagore timeless in our societies. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.